Well, thank you. It's great to be here. We'll go ahead and get started. I wanted to acknowledge my disclosures. And when I think about the role of increased dietary protein, I always take a step back and think, when we're assembling the pieces in terms of healthy living, what role does increased protein or higher protein diets play a role within that? And there are proposed benefits that you're all familiar with, weight management, fitness, and performance, as well as reducing the risk of quite a few chronic diseases, sarcopenia, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and metabolic syndrome. And so, my charge today is really to give you an overview of what we know about protein research to date, talking about the mechanisms as well as the practical aspects. And so when I try to assemble the pieces, if you will, there's 4 main ones that we know of to date where you see that eating more protein elicits these effects. And I'll just show you a snapshot view of the current research that we have on those. And that being that eating more protein leads to greater weight loss, greater fat loss, the ability to retain more lean mass or muscle while losing weight. And then the other part, which is somewhat of a mechanism as well, is really this concept of eating protein, does it actually reduce daily food intake as a potential mechanism? And I'm trying to figure out, because of the 2 screens, if I want to use a pointer or the mouse. So I'll try the mouse and so we'll see what happens. And so there's 2 main meta-analyses, actually quite a few that have come out in the last couple years, but just going to highlight 2 today. The first one here is was done by Tom Weikerle's group in the University of Southern Australia, and they included 24 tightly controlled weight loss trials, and these were the ones that were less than 1 year in duration. On average, these studies were 12 weeks, and the volunteers either consumed a normal protein diet, which is, you can see here, the 18%, or a higher protein diet, which was 30%. The energy restriction diets that were imposed were about 1,500 calories. So we're not dealing with those very low energy calorie diets. It was about 1,500 calories. And let's see. And so what you can see here, throughout my talk, normal protein will be in black, high protein will be in red. And these are looking at changes in body weight as well as body composition throughout these interventions. And what you can see here, again, these were tightly controlled weight loss trials, and that both diets led to a significant amount of weight loss. It was about 20 pounds in these studies on average. But you start seeing differences depending on how much protein was consumed. Case in point, those that ate more protein had a greater amount of body weight loss, which is what you see here. In terms of fat mass loss, again, both diets elicited fat loss, but the higher protein version led to a greater amount of fat that was lost throughout these interventions. And then something that seems to be very unique and specific to higher protein diets is the ability to retain lean mass or muscle while losing weight. And you can see here that although both diets led to a certain amount of lean mass loss over these interventions, the higher protein diet was able to preserve more lean mass compared to the normal protein versions. Taking this a step further, Peter Clifton's group did these, they were 32 weight loss trials in these, and I apologize, I didn't mention that. The one on the left was a meta-analysis, as was the one on the right, and the one on the right here is looking at the weight loss trials of greater than 1 year in duration. These were less tightly controlled because they were longer. You can see very, very similar things in terms of changes in body weight and fat loss, such that these higher protein diets had improvements in weight management compared to the normal protein versions. Just a real small point of note here, though, is you don't see that preservation of lean mass in these longer-term trials. It's been speculated that it has to do with the ability to have a lower amount of compliance over the long term with these diets, and so they really weren't consuming that 30% protein, which really suggests that you maybe need that amount of protein to preserve more lean mass, but maybe less protein is needed for changes in weight management. All right, so these are the 2 main meta-analyses that support this concept of eating more protein for weight management. Taking this a step further, though, it does seem to be that you can lose weight on just about any diet if you adhere to it. The next step is being able to keep that weight off over the long term. And so I just want to highlight the Diogenes study. This is the largest pan-European trial known to date. It was in over 1,000 adults, and it was initially the volunteers in this study had to lose about 8% of their initial body weight, and you can see here that they initially lost about 11 kilograms. And then they were on a weight maintenance trial, and they were randomized either into consuming a normal protein diet of 13% of protein versus a high protein diet, which is 22%. You can see that's a very modest amount of protein within that diet. And what I'm showing today is just looking at changes in body weight over the 26-week period intervention. This was a multi-site trial. And so in all of these trials, this was a combination of what you see here. Again, the high protein is in red, the black is normal protein. And you can see here over the course of this study that there was a small increase in weight regain, but the amount of weight that was regained was less following the higher protein diet compared to the normal protein. You see that those that were eating just a normal or standard amount of protein steadily regained the weight that they had lost. Some of the multi-site trials took that out an additional 26-week period, and you can see even a bigger separation over the 52-week period, again, such that eating more protein over a weight maintenance period prevented that weight regain. And they also looked at changes in body composition, and they can see that less fat was regained following the higher protein diet compared to the normal protein of about 1.6 kilograms. All right, again, supporting this concept of eating more protein for weight management. All right, and then the next piece that I always present on this, and I kind of just end it there, but I wanted to tease this out a little bit more. That's this concept of, we see that eating protein leads to changes in body composition and weight loss, and it's been proposed that when you eat protein, you voluntarily reduce your daily food intake. But when you start looking at the research, it's very, very limited in nature, and we generally cite this study, which is fantastic, and it is really a landmark study. But there's some other things I want to point out. And so this was done by David Weigel some time ago now. And it was a free living ad libitum feeding trial in which there was a certain time period, about 14 days, in which the volunteers came in and were fed a normal protein diet. Then there were 14 days of consuming a higher protein diet. And this was in which there was about 30% of the diet was protein. And then the remainder of this study had 30% protein in the diet, but then ad libitum energy. So in essence, everything was in proportion, but they had to have a 30% protein, but then they could have as much fat and carbohydrates as they wanted. And what you can see here is that as soon as they were allowed to eat ad libitum, again, adhering to that 30% of their intake as protein, they voluntarily or spontaneously reduced their daily food intake by about 450 calories. All right, pretty remarkable considering the fact that just having people eat more protein, they reduce their daily food intake. And this is really the landmark trial that we refer to with this idea of what eating more protein can do. But to take it a step back, I do want to add some other data, and that being when you look at a lot of the acute trials and whether protein has an effect on food intake, it's a little bit different. And so we did a systematic review that's in AJCN in 2015 in which these are all acute meal studies in which the volunteers were fed either a normal protein versus a high protein diet. And again, I'm happy to share these slides with you all later. I think they'll be posted so you can see these. But the lower protein meals here are on the left, and then the higher protein versions are on the right. And I go from higher to lower here. And then this is the subsequent meal energy intake. And if you look at acute trials, generally that's what you see. They're generally 4 hours in duration. The majority of them are at breakfast, and then 4 hours later at lunch is when they assess food intake. And as you can see here on the right-hand side is, the zeros or the nulls indicate that there were no differences. The hyphen is that they didn't assess food intake. And then you can see that there were 3 studies out of this bunch that showed a decrease in subsequent meal food intake with these higher protein breakfast meals. All right, so when you actually summarize that really suggests that only about 18% report reductions in subsequent food intake. All right, that initially you would think that that's a red flag. I think from a methodology standpoint, I think that really suggests that just looking at that next eating occasion is not representative of what we would see in an entire diet. All right, so just keep that in mind. I mean, I think acute meal studies, and we do them all the time, are very beneficial. But I think when you start looking at some of these outcomes, I think we need to take that a step further. And so we just recently completed a study. We presented this at EB this past year. And I should mention on the left with Weigel's study here, when they assessed daily food intake, it was with dietary food records. And we know at times that there are some limitations with that. And so in our study, what we did is we did a free living semi-ad libitum feeding trial in which we set the protein at a very specific amount, and then we allowed carbohydrates and fats to vary. And we compared a standard diet, which was about 15% of daily intake as protein. And within that, we used a 15-gram protein per meal paradigm. And we compared that to the higher protein diets, which was 25% of daily intake as protein, with about 30 grams of protein per meal. All right, and this is what our menus look like. And so these were tightly controlled because we provided these foods to the volunteers. And they were required to eat the protein-rich foods at each eating occasion. And then you can see here that the ad libitum carbohydrates and fat foods were allowed to vary. So the picture on the right is an example of our breakfast. What's in the middle is a scramble that had eggs and lean steak. So they had to eat that, and then they could have as much banana bread and Nutella and grapes as they wanted, all right? And we did that throughout each eating occasion to see, Does eating protein and making sure that you're eating your protein, all of the protein that we're recommending, does it actually reduce within meal food intake and then, of course, across the day? Surprisingly, not quite what we expected. This is looking at food intake in calories, and this is protein intake. And we can see by default, they ate more protein in the high protein group because they were required to eat a certain amount compared to the normal protein. But you see the panel here in the middle. This is the ad libitum carbohydrates and fat intake. We don't see any differences. And that suggests that when people are left to their own accord, when they're eating within a meal, eating either a normal protein or high protein, they ate the same amount of carbohydrates and fats as they wanted to or as that they had done in the past. All right, so then when you look at total daily intake, there was relatively no differences. Visibly, the higher protein diet led to a little bit of increase, but was not significant, mainly because of the protein that we were giving them. All right, so this is really one of the first studies that we're starting to look at and say, well, where do we go from here? And I think, these were really only 7-day diets. So taking this out over the longer term and doing more tightly controlled designs like this may be a good strategy. We're also trying to see that there's a lot of behavioral components that we generally miss in these acute trials, really having people mindful of why they're eating and being mindful of their hunger cues, and we didn't do that in this study either. All right, and so just something to keep in mind that I generally throw out this idea that eating protein voluntarily reduces daily food intake, and that's really only from one study, and the other ones are, there's really just limited research with that. All right, so I put that in my puzzle piece with a question mark because I don't really think that's been teased out as much. But then, when you start filling in the other pieces, that's where a lot of the mechanisms come in, which I think downstream have a lot of health implications in terms of metabolic health, as well as body composition changes and things like that. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We know that eating more protein has a metabolic effect. It's a difference in substrate utilization as well as resting energy expenditure. We also know that eating protein can stimulate protein synthesis, which downstream can have an effect on lean mass. I'm not going to talk about those today. I know Sue Phillips will do that precedingly. My research is really looking at the other end of the energy spectrum, and that being daily food intake, and whether if you eat protein, what is it about protein that maybe elicits a change in food intake, and that being appetite control and satiety. And so I always show these pictures because I feel like a picture makes this discussion easier, because when you look at ingestive behavior, frankly, it's just a muddled mess of all different factors, and so I try to arbitrarily tease these out. So the first one everybody can relate to, this is homeostatic hunger, right? So I got in at 5 this morning and didn't have, I missed dinner last night and my breakfast was messed up. And so this was me right before I went down to have something to eat today. We can relate to that, right? It's very tangible. If you're trying to lose weight and you're not eating or you've skipped a meal, we are very, very hungry, and we have powerful cues at play that stimulate our drive to eat. And that's generally homeostatic or energy sensing, right? This is very, very real and very powerful. But we also have this, right? So after a full course meal, or a kid comes home from school and his mom just made cupcakes, or the dessert tray comes out and we are, quote, hungry, right? But it has nothing to do with our energy needs. It has to do with the fact that we know these foods are highly rewarding and we want those. We have cravings for these types of foods. All right, so it really is this interplay between these two different types of eating behavior that's driving us to eat. And we always say, in the obesogenic environment, it's most likely that this is the issue with obesity, because everything is rewarding and it's free and it's available. The issue, though, is in many of you that do energy restriction trials, if you put somebody on an energy restriction, they are very, very hungry from a physiological standpoint, and that level of hunger also makes things look more rewarding. Right? I don't think anybody thinks broccoli is rewarding, but there's certain foods that become more rewarding whenever you are energy deprived. And so it really is both of these pieces working together. On the other end, we also have homeostatic satiety, right? So after a meal, we feel full and we have gut signals that respond accordingly. And again, that's more energy sensing. And then something that we always define is really hedonic satisfaction. So once you have a bite of a piece of cake, you have reward. You have dopamine that gets secreted and you feel reward. We ignore it and eat the whole thing, right? But it does suggest that we have these cues at play, all right? And so globally, we ask, well, does protein affect each of these different things? And just real quick, these are some of the ways that we do that from a research standpoint. Our hypotheses are that what you eat or what you don't eat affects these gut signals that then downstream act in the very specific regions of the brain that elicit these feelings of hunger and fullness, all right? And so for the gut responses, they are very much energy sensing. If you're not eating, ghrelin is secreted. It's a hunger hormone. If you've eaten protein or some other foods, you get satiety signals that are secreted and respond accordingly. And so that's more homeostatic in nature. When you start thinking about the hedonic aspects, that's really all the reward environmental stimuli. All right, and so if you think about it, all of those stimuli, whether it's eating together, buy one, get one free, TV food ads, all of these things are stimulating us to eat. The only thing that I can think of that prevents us from eating is that we run out of money. Then we take out the card and have at it, right? So when you think about all this, these things are all driving us to eat. And a lot of this goes right into your brain, and it's more cognitive in nature. All right, and so one of the ways that we assess that is using FMRI, because we want to look at the neural signals that are tied into food cravings and food reward. And so this is an overgeneralization, but in essence, what happens is when people are exposed to these highly appealing food or highly rewarding food stimuli, and they're hungry, you get a very significant activation in very specific regions of the brain that are reward-driven. All right? When you're full and you're exposed to these stimuli, you can see that these responses are less. These are not the ones that are tied into cognitive function and performance. So I don't want you to walk away saying, well, if I'm hungry, I'm going to be smarter. Not really, it doesn't work that way. It's really the ones that are reward-driven in nature. And so again, to overlay that, does protein affect all of these different aspects? And I'm just going to show you a quick snapshot view of that. All right, and so we've done quite a few acute meal studies in adults, and you can see here that we provide a different range of protein, normal versus high protein. And these are looking at the perceived sensation. So in essence, we ask volunteers, how hungry are you, how full do you feel over a 4-hour period, and we track that. And so the time point 0 is when a meal is given, and you can see that both a normal protein versus a high protein meal, all of them reduce hunger, perceived hunger, rightly so. I mean, generally these meals are about 350 to 500 calories, but you start seeing differences in perceived hunger depending on the protein. Such that when the volunteers eat a higher protein meal, they have reduced hunger that is sustained over the next 4-hour period compared to the normal protein version. All right, we see the same thing in an opposite manner with fullness, which is a marker of satiety, in that you get an increase in fullness right away, and then that is maintained, that's higher with higher protein meals over this 4-hour period compared to the normal protein versions. All right. We also start looking at the mechanisms of action, and just the two that I'm going to show today is one is ghrelin. It's that hunger hormone that I talked about that has been associated with meal initiation and increase in perceived hunger. And you can see here that both meals reduce ghrelin after the meal is consumed, but you see that ghrelin is blunted throughout this 4-hour period compared with a high protein compared to the normal protein meal. And actually, if you look at, this is right before lunchtime, and you can see that ghrelin response is very, very low compared to the normal protein version. So when you're trying to target certain strategies to prevent overeating at that next eating occasion, this would lend support for that. And then lastly, PYY is a really potent satiety signal, and you can see that it rises with both meals, but it has a greater elevation over that 4-hour period with a high protein compared to a normal protein meal. All right, so again, really showing these mechanisms by which protein has an effect on appetite control and satiety. And then the last part that I want to talk about is this idea of food cravings. And so to go back a little bit, our volunteers either have a normal protein or high protein meal, and then about 4 hours later, they go into the brain imaging, the FMRI. So it's a functional MRI. And when they're in there, they see different food stimuli that are highly appealing and highly rewarding. And when they see something like that, you get a neural activation, and we try to focus on those cortical limbic regions that are tied to food cravings. And here's what we find. All right, and so this is about 4 hours after these meals were given, and this is the normal protein response to these food stimuli and the high protein response. And what you can see here is once somebody had a normal protein meal, 4 hours later, when they're exposed to these stimuli, they have activation in the insula and in the prefrontal cortex, but when they had the higher protein version, those responses are blunted. All right, and those reasons are important because they're the ones, for example, insula, which is tied to reward, all different types of reward, but in this case, really looking at food cravings. And that really illustrates the fact that when you have protein, it blunts those reward-driven neural responses. Prefrontal is more executive control, and I always say this in a very lay term. This is really saying, in the middle of the night you wake up and I want something junky, I'm going to go have some ice cream. The prefrontal cortex is walking down to the refrigerator to have it. All right, and so this is really saying what we're seeing with protein, that it can affect both homeostatic eating behavior as well as hedonic eating behavior. All right. And then we also follow that up with just perceived feelings of cravings, and we've shown that high protein meals tend to reduce perceived cravings for high fat foods compared to the normal protein meals. All right, so then that's really just the summary that we have in terms of the pieces of the puzzle, if you will, as far as how we propose that higher protein diets are eliciting these effects on weight management and other outcomes. But one of the things that we're really interested in is getting involved with are the fact that there's key protein-related factors that are critically tied into these different outcomes. And due to time, I'm not going to go into these except for one, but I will mention that how much protein is needed is really important. We used to think of protein in the context of a diet, but now we're starting to see that there's very specific meal quantities that are needed to elicit these responses. I know just from interacting with Stu that he will touch on that with his talk. Energy status, so whether you're trying to lose weight and you're energy restricted versus trying to maintain weight, that has an effect in terms of the protein response. Protein quality, whether it's plant or animal-based proteins, food form. All of these things have a direct effect on all of these outcomes that I mentioned. One of the things that our lab is really, as of late, really interested in is this idea of timing of consumption. So when should you have your protein? And it was based on the fact that we did a study some time ago in which we were trying to see whether you felt fuller when you had a higher protein breakfast compared to a high protein lunch or a high protein dinner. And that's the study that we did. Volunteers came in and they either had a high protein breakfast followed by a normal lunch and a normal dinner versus a high protein lunch or a high protein dinner. And we just looked at fullness over the next 3-hour period. And the high protein breakfast is in red, and you can see all the other ones kind of all merged together here. And so it's easy and visibly and statistically to see that a high protein breakfast elicited a greater feeling of fullness after that meal compared to when that protein was consumed at lunch or at dinner. Oddly, we carried that out for an entire 10-hour testing day, and we found that elevation after the breakfast meal was even sustained into the evening before going to bed when they had a high protein breakfast compared to whenever that protein was consumed at lunch or at dinner. So really suggesting there's something novel about having that protein in the morning. So another reason to pair that in terms of breakfast is this looking at, well, what are people eating throughout the day? And so this is some NHANES data looking at protein consumption in adults at these different eating occasions. And one of the things that you can see is breakfast is fairly poor in the protein content that people are consuming. It's about 10 grams of protein. And so if we think protein is beneficial in the morning, well, this would be a good target because people are just not eating the amount of protein that we think that they need. In addition to that, we also know there's data that suggests that up to about 60% of young people skip breakfast frequently. All right, and why does that matter? Well, there's a lot of correlational data showing that skipping breakfast is strongly associated with obesity-related outcomes. Specifically, skipping breakfast is associated with higher BMI, gains in body fat, a greater body weight, and a greater prevalence of being obese. While they're correlational at best, that's really where our research came in, is we were trying to see whether there's a causal relationship between breakfast skipping and obesity. And so it really is a good tie-in with saying, well, if we have individuals who skip breakfast, what would happen if we take these higher protein breakfast meals and have them consume them? All right, and so we did a series of studies, both acute and long-term, and I'm just gonna briefly mention them today. And they were in overweight and obese breakfast skipping young people, generally adolescents, somewhere between 13 and 19 years of age. And within these trials, they were all breakfast skippers at baseline, and we fed them either a 350-calorie normal protein breakfast or a high protein breakfast. And you can see the protein loads here, about 15 grams in the normal protein versus 30 grams in the high protein. And then we compared that to their breakfast skipping trial. All right, and so the figure here on the left is just looking at perceived fullness across the entire day. Time point 0 is at breakfast, and then this was given, standardized normal protein lunch was given with each of these different trials. Breakfast skipping is in black, and you can see here that when the breakfast skippers came in, they were not full. Normal protein is in blue and the high protein is in red, and you can see that once these meals were given, very high increase in fullness after that breakfast, and you can see then it steadily drops until lunch is given. Just a point, though, that at almost every time point, perceived fullness is higher following that higher protein breakfast. And then you also see some separation here after this standardized lunch. When you look at it from a context of a 10-hour testing day, so this is looking at daily fullness with breakfast skipping, normal and high protein breakfast meals, you see that these different letters denote significance. And so both breakfast meals led to a greater feeling in daily fullness compared to breakfast skipping, but we see that the higher protein breakfast led to a greater feeling of daily fullness compared to the normal protein version. All right, keep in mind, these aren't high protein diets. We're really just modulating breakfast, and we can see that there's effects across the entire day. Not a boatload of other things, but there are a lot of other outcomes, and I'm not going to show the data today, but when you compare these to breakfast skipping or normal protein breakfast, we also saw that eating a high protein breakfast blunted ghrelin, which is that hunger hormone. It increased PYY, which is satiety, and all of these were throughout the day. It also decreased evening brain activation that are associated with food cravings. And I think that's really important because most of the time when you look at kids, they have a tendency to snack on high-fat, high-sugar foods later in the evening, and that's really where most of their energy content is occurring with these, about 3 p.m. to 10 p.m. It's like a feeding trough for these kids. A lot of them don't even have dinner. And so along with that, we actually looked at evening intake, and we found that when they have a high-protein breakfast, they reduce their evening snacks of high-fat, high-sugar foods. All right, so this is really illustrating the fact that eating protein in the morning can improve diet quality. We followed that up then over a long-term trial. It was about 12 weeks in duration to look at more practical outcomes, that being daily food intake and then changes in body composition. And so the figure here on the left is looking at daily food intake. Breakfast skipping is here, normal protein, and then high protein. And you can see that when the volunteers, I need to take a step back. We only gave them and required them to eat their breakfast or to skip breakfast. Everything else they could have as much or as little as they wanted. We didn't control that in this study. We only controlled breakfast. And so what you see here is that when the volunteers had a high protein breakfast, they voluntarily reduced their daily food intake by about 400 calories compared to breakfast skipping, and that was also tended to be different than the normal protein breakfast. All right, so again, here we're starting to see more some practical outcomes. And then the last part is looking at changes in fat mass over this time period. You know, if you look at that correlational data, and we did this with the breakfast skippers, those that continued to skip breakfast actually gained body fat over the intervention, which is what you see here in the black bar. However, the high protein breakfast, and only the high protein breakfast, prevented that body fat gain over that time period compared to the normal protein version. All right, and so again, going full circle with this idea that there does seem to be a unique role with eating protein in the morning for these different types of outcomes. So just to summarize, consuming a diet higher in protein appears to improve weight management, and it seems to do this, at least in the outcomes that we're targeting, that being increase in appetite control and satiety, as well as reducing food cravings and food reward. And then, as I just said, there seems to be this unique benefit around the idea of consuming a protein-rich breakfast for weight management. And so I just wanted to thank my co-investigators who I've been working with, my funding sources who without them this research wouldn't have been possible, and then my grad students, med students and undergrads. And I knew I was coming here, and this is San Diego, and everybody seemed to be gloom and doom because it wasn't sunny. That's Purdue, but that's not Purdue right now. So I put that on to make you feel better, but just know that it's 60 degrees there. And so it's actually warmer there than it is here, but I thought, well, I'll put that up to make you feel better, even though it really doesn't. So thank you with that, and I'm happy to take questions.
That's just excellent, Heather. We'll now entertain questions, and I see Dr. Hill is going to be first up.
Hi, Heather. Great work. I generally agree with you on the benefit of high-protein diets. However, I think it may be a little bit more complex. So in our intervention studies, if we increase protein, we have to decrease something. Right. So in Scott Weigel's study, it was actually a low-fat diet, if I remember. I think it went from 35 to 20% fat, and I think there's some evidence lower fat has an effect too. I think you really nicely showed how protein can kind of affect the metabolic state, but I think it works the other way around too. I think the metabolic state can actually affect the benefits of certain diets. Sure. So we're actually going to present some data at ADA with the Diogenes folks that we've reanalyzed some of that data, and you can actually predict better weight loss based on things like fitness and insulin sensitivity and metabolic flexibility. So there's this fascinating potential interaction where you might be able to match diet to metabolism, and the diet may change the metabolism, which in turn changes the diet. So in weight loss, you might start out on one diet and actually then later on switch to another diet. So what do you think of kind of that concept?
Conceptually, I think that is a viable strategy. The same thing with exercise, and we've talked about that too. It seems as if, there's always this conflict with whether you should exercise while you're losing weight or afterwards, and I think definitely there's a proponent when you're trying to maintain weight, exercise works. I don't know if we know enough information to know whether protein, we don't have it in our group as far as looking at all these studies and sectioning out people that lose more weight or improvements in composition with higher protein versus those that are eating less protein. And I think at this point, unless that the research really is yet to be seen. Conceptually, it makes sense. I just don't know if we can clearly say, based on the fact that all the studies that I know from an appetite and satiety researcher, if we're hanging our hat on that is a potential mechanism, we consistently see whether in every population that we've studied that people feel fuller on protein. Right. Doesn't mean they're going to adhere to it, but conceptually they are more satisfied and they feel better. But I don't know if we know enough to know whether, I do think there's certain people that would benefit more. We have a paper in 2010 that actually showed that those that were obese actually didn't respond as well to a higher protein diet than those that were just normal weight. Yeah. And so I do think that there are differences with that. I think globally, you do start seeing this theme with just eating more protein has these benefits across the board. It may be better in others and maybe not as optimal in certain populations.
Yeah, but just like we're talking about personalized medicine and personalized nutrition, I think we will get to personalized weight loss.
Yep.
And I think in general, high proteins diet is going to be a strong part of that. But I think as we get better in identifying these things, we will be able to match person both to initial diet and maybe long-term diet.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think timing of consumption, too. I think, when we take our breakfast skippers, it's actually easier to see, it is very easy to see these outcomes. Maybe not so different in people that snack. I mean, is it better to have a high-protein snack or not snack at all? And I think that is really where you get with personal nutrition. So really good point, Jim.
Hi, Heather. Great talk. Josh Anthony from Campbell Soup Company. Kind of a question in two parts that actually builds off the last point you're making with snacking. The first part is just, I know you acknowledged protein quality, but didn't have a lot of chance to get into it. Maybe a word or two about quality. And part of the reason that I ask is that I'm sure you're well aware that, as we look across from an industry standpoint, the formulation challenges, right? It's one thing if you have, 15 grams in a relatively high-calorie meal and then you're seeing a good effect at 28 to 50 grams. But we're struggling with two things. The first one being is that we're getting a lot of call to action to include other proteins that are coming from other sources, right? Plant sources in particular, where the quality might not be as high. And obviously from a snackification standpoint, it's difficult to formulate with that level of protein. So the question underpinning quality is amino acids as signaling molecules to help to stimulate some of these satiety effects that you're seeing. So.
Sure. So to that point, I'm sure, Stu, you're probably going to talk about some of the signals with protein synthesis, or at least touch on that. So I'll stay clear of that for now, so I don't steal Stu's thunder, although he has enough thunder on his own, I think. But from a satiety standpoint, bluntly, I don't know if there's not a clear evidence that suggests that there's a very specific amino acid consistently that leads to more satiety than others. And I think that's harder because we eat protein, as you know. So when you start having them eat amino acids that are very bitter and taste terrible, it really confounds the satiety piece. And so you always have to pitch that in a different type of protein. We've done that. Marguerite Westerterp-Plantanga has done that quite a bit, and we're doing it more frequently. To be blunt, there just isn't a lot of differences when you look across the boards for plant-based proteins and animal-based proteins. I think the caveat with that is most of the time it's looking at casein, soy, and whey, and it's not encompassing all of them. There's also a palatability issue. And so we're in the process of doing a tightly controlled study to tease that out. But another point with that is a lot of these trials are with shakes, and we know that drinking your protein is not as satiating as eating them. And so there's this whole host of these factors it's just very difficult to tease that out. So I go back to more of a practical standpoint with protein source. And if you're trying to adhere, and then I'll get to your quantity, because that's actually really important too. But if you're trying to adhere to roughly 30 grams of protein or just more protein than what you're eating, it's just very easy to do with animal-based proteins because they're protein dense, right? I mean, if you look at just whey protein or any type of meat or eggs, it's just very high in protein compared to a plant-based source that just has carbohydrates and healthy fibers and things like that, but it's just a higher bulk to get to that. And so I always default back to globally, when I'm trying to recommend, it's nice to have animal-based proteins in there because then you can make a meal look feasible compared to something like this. But to your point, too, and we've done quite a lot of snacking studies, and we generally use Greek yogurt as a vehicle because you can get a decent amount of protein in there. On average, we get about 24 grams of protein. There are other studies that show that you don't need 30 grams of protein. It's this wiggle room that we just really don't know. It's about anywhere from 20 to 30 grams, but even that's a daunting task. And so, I think for scientists, it's like go big or go home, right? You start big, and the table that I showed is actually dismal, right? When the first studies, they're feeding people like 250 grams of protein. Well, that's not feasible by any level. So at some point, it's like, okay, well, we see an effect, and then we titrate down. Well, right now, we're sitting at about 20 to 30 grams. Whether we can have a little bit lower than that if it's a higher quality, or maybe you need more if it's plant-based, I don't know if we just know that from a satiety standpoint. There's a meta-analysis looking at weight management with protein source or protein quality, and they showed no effects with protein source. And so honestly, there just haven't been enough high-quality, long-term, not saying that the quality it's just they're not long-term randomized control trials of this nature to actually make that determination. And I think it's just because it's also intermixed with a lot of these other factors like food form and a whole host of things. So I don't know if that answered your question, but you're 100% right. We just don't know enough about titrating down. Or, there's some ideas that maybe you can have like 2 small snacks, and that would equal a certain amount of protein, and over that time, maybe that's okay, or maybe a small breakfast and then a mid-morning snack to get to the quantity of protein that this research is illustrating.
Oh, that absolutely addresses it, but one of the things I'm thinking about is as opposed to saying adding in supplemental amino acids,
Right.
I've seen some of the work that looks at reduced protein quality or a diet that is limiting in one or more amino acids and what that does to food intake. I didn't know if there's a strategy where you could actually use a lower quality plant protein. So you provide the protein, but because it's limiting in an acute sense, that could actually reduce
Yeah.
intake. And
Sure.
I
Yeah.
didn't know if anybody's looked at that
No,
from that side.
not
so.
to my knowledge, but that's a good strategy. The only thing that I caution is generally a lot of those sources are just not as palatable. And so people just gravitate to, if you're accustomed to animal-based proteins, and I just view it as a steak is very palatable and very savory. It's far different than having pea protein. And I'm not dogging on pea protein, I think is a use for it. I just think when you look at the palatability, it gets there's very differences depending on that. And so I think I go back to whole blends and mixing things, because I think that's where the best strategy is, but really good point. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you for a great talk and a great discussion.